There we go. There we go. Okay, now we're on. All right. Perfect. There we go. All right.
There we are.
Yep. All right. So, happy holidays, everyone. As I was just saying, we're going to start with a little bit of announcements, and we're going to do the presentation on solar ponds, Unique Dickensians, and then also the book, The Three-Pipe Christmas, which I sent out to you all. As you know, when you're a member of 5 Miles, you always get to read the story for free, okay? And then we'll have our discussion of the adventure of the Unique Dickensians. So pretty exciting. Great meeting for December. All right, first just want to say happy holidays to everyone. There actually are over 30 holidays between now and January 15th, which I thought was really cool, just as a little FYI. And so no matter what holiday you celebrate, or if you celebrate people, just wanted to say, there's a dog that celebrates quite a few. Very cool.
So say all of us.
That's right. But I just wanted to say, no matter what holiday you celebrate, enjoy the holiday and the festivities. This is a very, very fun time of year. Also, just as a reminder, which we talked about last time too, that Sherlock Holmes weekend's coming up in January. So there's the Society of London annual dinner, which is January 8th this year. And then the BSI weekend in person, actually both events are in person, is January 12th through 16th in New York City. Okay, I'm hoping the Omicron doesn't mess with those plans, but as of right now, that's where we're at. If you do get a chance to, if you are going to the BSI weekend, and I know some of our international members aren't making it this year for safety reasons, then Brian and I are going to be in the Merchants Room Saturday, January 15th from 9 a.m. to noon. And Nancy Holder, who's also on here, who is going to do a book signing with us at 10 a.m. that day. We're looking really forward to it for Sherlock Holmes of Baking Street, which she presented on, I think back in, was it August or September, I think, is when Nancy presented that, an essay from that for us. It was a really fun meeting. All right. So the big question of the day, or to talk about, is who is this Solar Pons character, and why do we call him the Sherlock Holmes of Prod Street? Okay, and maybe, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Michael Newman, is it Prod Street or Parade Street?
I think it's Parade Street.
Is it?
I've always thought it was Parade Street.
Okay. Parade Street it is then. So Solar Pons came into being out of Sherlock Holmes is a famous quote from August Derleth. And really, the whole character of Solar Pons started with a letter that Derleth wrote to Sir Arthur back in 1928. August Derleth was just 19 years old at the time, and he asked Sir Arthur if he intended to write any more Sherlock Holmes adventures. And Doyle responded that he did not. So Derleth, with a zest reserved for those in their late teens or early 20s, took it upon himself to compose his own Holmes adventures. Okay, he didn't take the no. He was like, if he's not going to do it, I'm going to do it.
Well, actually, my understanding of the story is that that Doyle told him, you can do detective stories, but just don't call your detective Sherlock Holmes.
David, do you have any info on that?
Wasn't that part of the story? That's the way I always heard it.
In Derleth's, one of his essays at the front of one of his books, he did get a second letter from Doyle, who said you can kind of do what you want, but yeah, don't do that.
Okay.
So there were 2 letters exchanged. I don't know that they found all those letters, but Derleth refers to them.
Okay, cool. But anyway, in any case, Derleth did take it upon himself to compose his own adventures, and he did create Solar Pons out of that, okay? And then from the 1920s onward through his life, Derleth wrote over 70 Pons stories. So he wrote more Pons stories than Doyle wrote Holmes stories.
But not more than David Marcum.
That is true.
That's right.
And pretty much he was a big hit with Sherlock Holmes fans all through the time from the 20s onward until the last collection, The Chronicles of Solar Pons, was published in 1973. And the story we're discussing today, Unique Dickensians, was in that final collection. We'll talk a little bit more about its publication in a minute. So Pons started out really as a thinly veiled version of Holmes, okay? He had his own companion in Dr. Parker instead of Dr. Watson. He had Mrs. Johnson as his landlady instead of Mrs. Hudson. And he had the brother Bancroft instead of Mycroft. And he had the Praed Street Irregulars working for him instead of the Baker Street Irregulars. So there was it was very clear cut what Derleth was doing. However, over time, I mean, the character really changed as he wrote more Pons adventures. And instead of being a clone of Holmes, we do see that he kind of developed into having his own personality, which it's good we read this story, which is the latest short story, because you really see that in this. Pons is just much cheerier than Holmes. I mean, you know, he's humming Christmas tunes at his home. He's very excited about the snow and the festive time of year in this particular story. You wouldn't really see Holmes acting that way necessarily. Maybe he'd be observing the snow and making comments about it, but usually not just excited about it snowing. So I think that's a big difference. Also, and this is one that's kind of a criticism about the character, is that Holmes actually was much kinder towards Watson than Pons was towards Parker. And, you know, some of us Holmesians might be like, my God, I mean, you know, how can you be worse? Because there are times when Holmes is quite mean to Watson. But we seem to be more biting throughout towards Parker in the Pons stories. And of course, unlike Holmes, Pons really pushes into the area of pulp fiction. He delved into parody, like the story, The Adventure of the Orient Express, which the title alone, you can tell what he's parodying there. Horror, like in The Adventure of the Nosferatu, which is a story that strongly implies that there are vampires. And science fiction, like The Adventure of the Snitch in Time, which is actually a comedy as well, but does have a bit of a time traveler in it. And one of the favorite villains of Solar Pons was based on Fu Manchu. And it pretty much is Fu Manchu, but because of copyright, Derleth could never use that name. He mentions the Sci-Fan. He was the leader of the Sci-Fan, but never says that he is, you know, Fu Manchu. All right. Another thing I think is important to note about Pons is just how much he was embraced by the Holmes community. And they actually, Luther Norris, who's a BSI, started the Praed Street Irregulars in the 60s, I believe. And it was dedicated for the same reasons, to keep the memory of Solar Pons alive, that they thought this character was important, just like Holmes, not as important, of course, but was, you know, deserved his own fan club in a sense, okay? And there was actually Pons scholarship. The Pontine Dossier was published from 1967 to 1977. And this pin, you see this image here, is a PSI pin. It's from the collection of John Bennett Shaw. So Shaw was a member of the Praed Street Irregulars. And it's now housed in the University of Minnesota Special Collection. So it's really cool. And then there is a new edition of the dossier that Brian and I published. So we're starting to get the Pons scholarship back now.
Yay.
So now we come to the Unique Dickensians. And after I talk a little about this, I'm going to call on David with a few questions about the story. So this was the last Solar Pons short story by Derleth. He published it in the late 60s, I think 68. There was only one other Solar Pons novella, novel. It was a very short novel, though, that was published after this, but this was it. And it was actually, even though it's a short story, as you guys are aware of, it was published first as a limited edition book. There are only 2,021 copies. You can kind of see what he's doing there with the number. But if after this book came out, the story was included in the book, the last book, The Chronicles of Solar Pons, okay? Which brings us to today. Unfortunately, in the really after the last publication, the early, I think late 70s was the last edition of the Chronicles until we put another edition out a few years back. And a huge thank you to David Marcum, because he really helped get that. We work with the estate of August Derleth, and he was able to redo the book through a scanning of the original pages and editing them and putting them together. Is there anything you would add about the story, David?
Derleth just wrote Solar Pond stories hit or miss just every few years. It wasn't like he was trying to write a dozen at one time to make up a book or anything like that. So he wrote this one in 1968. He died in 1971. So there was still a big gap between this story and his death, where he didn't really do any Pons writing. And then it wasn't collected into the Chronicles until 1973, a couple of years after his death. So there was a lot of space in there. This one, I have actually a couple of copies of the limited edition too. There were actually a couple of editions before the one that that we did a few years ago. There was the one in the omnibus by George Vanderberg. There was the one it was split up into the separate stories into the Basil Copper omnibus. And there was also, let's see, I don't know the publisher, but there was this edition, which came out in England. So there were a few, but as it was with all Pons books, they were really only available to people who were willing to dig for them and try and find them. It was almost impossible to locate Pons since the 1970s when those Pinnacle paperbacks came out. So.
And how about the story itself? What can you tell us about how it developed, or like what he was trying to do with the story, with the humor and everything?
Well, I'm not a Derleth scholar. I don't know if there are any members of the August Derleth Society signed in today, so I can't say what was going on with his life or what he intended. I just know that it did end up almost being almost like a triple pastiche, because you have Holmes as Pons, or Pons as Holmes, which is just the overall Solar Pons big picture. But there's also the pastiche of A Christmas Carol. And some of it's pretty obvious, like a character named Ebenezer, who has a very angry outlook on life and doesn't like Christmas. And there's also, of course, a pastiche in a way of another Dickens character in this. It's Micah Auber. And this story is Micah Auber from David Copperfield. Mm. And there's just the whole overall Dickens connection, because they're both Dickens collectors, and the frantic fanaticism of collectors in general, which kind of ties into the other pastiche of the Unique Hamlet, which I will talk about in a minute, I'm sure, and Dan will get in more to how he associated those to come up with a book of all those books together.
Thank you. Yeah, that's next up. Excellent. All right, I'll hold my other questions for when we get more towards the end here, when we get the whole panel going. But because I do want to get over, and it's a great segue there, David, that in 2020, Dan Andriacco put together the collection Sherlock Holmes: A Three-Pipe Christmas, which is what I sent out to everybody, which included this story, and also had it was an illustrated book with 3 different illustrators. For those of you who've been here for a little while, we had last year for this December meeting, we actually discussed the Unique Hamlet for its 100th anniversary with the artist Karen Gosselin. You can see one of her images here. And we also had he included The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, which was illustrated by Jeff McKeever, who does a lot of the Strand illustrations. And then Brian, who's here today to talk a little about his artwork, did the adventure of the Unique Dickensians. And so I wanted to talk to Dan a little bit about what he was thinking, why he put these three stories together in this particular collection.
Well, do you want to hear a great story about that?
We do.
Unfortunately, I don't have one because I don't remember. This idea of putting the three together has been in my head for such a long time. I don't really remember when it began. However, I suspect that it started with the idea of the similarities between the Unique Hamlet and the Unique Dickensians. I don't know when I read the Unique Dickensians the first time, but I'm certain that I was already familiar with Unique Hamlet because I discovered Sterrett at a very young age. I was probably about 12 when I borrowed The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes from the Cincinnati Public Library. And I think, I'm not positive, but I'm almost sure that this is the edition that I borrowed, and the edition in which I first read The Private Life. Well, that includes in it, as the final chapter, the adventure of the Unique Hamlet. So I'm pretty sure that I had that in my head when I first read the Unique Dickensians. And of course, the similarities are just so obvious, starting with the title. And then there's the subject matter. They're both stories about book collectors, and in each case, a unique book. And then the tone is the same. They're both very satirical about collectors. And then it gets down to even closer parallels. The stories begin very similarly. In the Unique Hamlet, Watson is standing at the window and calls Holmes. In the Unique Dickensians, Pons is standing at the window and calls Parker. And of course, as we've noted, they were both issued as chapbooks originally. The Hamlet in 1920 and Dickensians in 1968. And interestingly, probably just a coincidence, but maybe not, the Dickensians is set in 1920, the very year that Hamlet was published. So there are all those connections. And so I know why I put those two together. I'm not entirely sure why it seemed to me that they fit with Blue Carbuncle, but they really do, because Blue Carbuncle, of course, is a Christmas story. And, both of those books, the chapbooks, were both issued at Christmas. And while the Blue Carbuncle didn't come out in the December issue, it did come out in the January issue of the magazine, The Strand.
Why do you think, one of the things that's interesting about this particular collection with these three stories is that every single, they're short stories, but all three of them at one point in time were issued as standalone books. Unique Hamlet and Dickensians, their first printing was as a book. And Blue Carbuncle, of course, was the infamous special edition that I believe the BSI published in the 40s. That's the blue cover, the slipcase. So why do you think maybe, and this is just speculation, and David, you could jump in too, do you think maybe these stories were published as independent books and not just, in the Strand?
Well, at one time, issuing chapbooks is something that fairly well-off hobbyists did. Edgar Smith issued a lot of them, from his pamphlet house. So I know that and I think Sterrett had a number of chapbooks through that particular publisher. David would probably know more about that than I do, but they were issued as Christmas presents. So I think that it was part of it was just kind of a thing that people did at that time.
Yeah, in terms of the Blue Carbuncle edition, I think people want to have something special associated with Christmas. And that's the closest thing there is to a Holmes Christmas story, even though it's set 2 days after Christmas and there's not a lot of Christmas decoration or Christmas carols or anything going along in the story. People kind of remember it that there's more Christmas in it than there actually is, but it's still...
That's a good point, David. And I wrote a blog post a while back about adaptations, both for radio and TV. And I think every single one of them moved the story to Christmas Eve.
Right.
But I think the Victorians probably had a stronger sense than we do generally, that Christmas is a season. It's not just one day.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think in my lifetime, I've seen a lot of advertising moving toward the idea that the 12 days of Christmas ends with Christmas. And of course, traditionally it doesn't. Christmas Day is just the beginning of the 12 days of Christmas.
Right.
So I think for the Victorians, it would have been very much a Christmas story. And I think there's even some mention when Holmes lets Horner off the hook in the end. He talks about it being a time of forgiveness.
Yeah, there's a Christmas goose, and there's just the whole benevolent ending
Right.
because of the season. Let him off the hook because of the season.
Yeah. And I think you made the point in your essay that as we read it, we tend to fill in the Christmas parts. We tend to almost imagine the carolers and the roasting chestnuts and all that stuff,
Right.
even though it's not mentioned.
Yeah, it is interesting that for 3-5 Christmas, this is the only the Unique Dickensians is the only technically Christmas story in it, because Blue Carbuncle happens afterwards, and Unique Hamlet, well, does not happen necessarily in the Christmas season,
Right.
you know, but it was written as a Christmas present. So
Yeah, it's drawing a Venn diagram of those three stories would be very complicated, because there are lots of things that two of them have in common. There's not really anything that all three have in common.
Mhm.
it's a good point.
You know, two are actually Sherlock Holmes stories as opposed to Solar Ponds. Two are actually books about, deal with collectors, etc.
Right. Well, I wanted to give Brian a chance to talk a little about his illustrations, and then we can probably open the discussion up to the group. And we have lots of questions you can ask everybody here. But Brian, for the book, and as you saw in the edition I sent you, he did illustrations for it. And this was the first, the frontispiece he had for the story, The Adventure of the Unique Dickensians. So Brian, why did you start with this particular image in mind, and why did you go with the art style you've kind of developed for your Solar Ponds book covers here?
Okay, well, it's a Solar Ponds story, so I was going to use my Solar Ponds style, which, as you can see, is a lot of heavy blacks and whites, heavy shading, a lot of heavy shading. Definitely, I take my influence from Frank Miller's Sin City and from early Bernie Wrightson's black and white work, like on Frankenstein, because to me, Solar Ponds really is, as you said earlier, part of the pulp era. So that's the bridge where there's the Lovecraft influence, there's car chases and Tommy guns in some of his stories. So that was and also I wanted a cover that you could see from across the room, which is how I developed that style. So I figured I had to keep that up for this. And also the kind of woodcut look it has, I thought was appropriate to a Christmas story. So for this first one, this came out a little cartoonier than I would have liked, but I think it adds to the spirit of it. And total vanity, I wanted to put my name next to August Derleth's on a story. That's just a little fan in me. And, publisher's right, what can I say? But I found that font that's very similar to the Nightmare Before Christmas style, which I thought really evoked the nice Victorian whimsy of the season there.
All right, let's go to the next one. So this one I really like. This is your first kind of story one. What made you decide to do this particular scene to start it off?
Well, this actually came about because my original concept was just to draw Ebenezer Snawley, but I'm like, no, I want to have him bursting in. That's what I want. And it's got to have that juxtaposed between Snolly sort of crabbing his way into the apartment and Pons like, oh, this will be interesting. So that's what I went with there. Also, by having him sort of walking in, it gives motion. Like you notice his elbow is forcing its way into the stillness of Pons. So that's deliberate on my part to make sure that it looks like he's like, I've got an issue and you're going to solve it and it's not going to cost me. I'm not going to pay a lot for this muffler. So
I particularly like the way you have like the nose and the chin jutting out in the character. It's great.
Yeah. I gotta just point out this is my favorite Solar Pons story. I mean, I love Solar Pons, but this story in particular, the voices just came to me. I could hear very clearly Ebenezer Snolly throughout the story. In fact, I made sure to read this story to my wife, who I'm sure has forgiven me by now, but just because I wanted to do the funny voice. It's just such a fun, whimsical story.
So do the voice.
Huh?
I said do the voice.
Oh, let's see here. Are you a medical man? I assured him that I was. Have a look at that, doctor, he said, indicating a small growth on one finger. I examined it and pronounced it the beginning of a wart. Ah, then it's of no danger to my health. I thank you. As you're not in your office, no doubt there'll be no fee. That's how I heard it in my head.
Can I suggest that you start doing audiobooks? Maybe some of mine.
I would have made an actor and a rare one, sir.
Thank you.
Add that to your list of talents, my friend. You get to do the audiobooks.
If I must.
All right, I want to move on to, let's look at some others here. Okay, the one, the image of the hansom there, or the horse-drawn carriage, is probably one of the ones that's noted a lot in this collection. Talk a little about how you got that snow effect. I think that really draws out that particular image.
I don't remember the beautiful. Well, here's the thing. My art style, I am completely self-taught. As far as Photoshop goes, if you have internet access, you can learn any Adobe system because there are so many tutorials out there. So I said to myself, all right, I need to do snow that doesn't look cartoony. And I spent an afternoon going through some tutorials and I taught myself how to do it. So that's this Photoshop overlay of an effect. And then I erased part of it up top, as you can see. So it's sort of like, so it kind of focuses in on the carriage. I had originally drawn it where they're passing a car and some pedestrians who are looking at the cart, but it was just too crowded. So I was like, I don't know, I've got to just focus on this. And I threw in some lighting effects in the lamps. If you can't really tell.
Brian, I have that illustration framed in my office, which is where I'm sitting right now.
Oh, that's right. I sent that to you. Oh, good.
Yes. I love the wood.
I'm glad it's got a good home. Thank you. See, again, I think it really lends itself to a Christmas story. You know, it's got that nice, I don't know, holiday look to it. And then the one on the right, as you can see, I just went total woodcut on that. And I basically just searched for a bunch of images of like Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners. And I copied them and did a lot of tracing. And what I'll do when I draw is I'll draw something in pencil. Then I do an overlay where I ink over it. I scan it into the computer, touch it up in Photoshop. I take the file, I move it into Illustrator and smooth it out. I move it back to Photoshop for final touch-ups. Then I upload it. it's a long process, but it's my process, and it's kind of given me my look. Boy,
Excellent.
that looks like a good dinner, actually.
Yes, I was just thinking. Too. Yeah, Snolly had to actually spend money on that one.
Yeah.
All right, and then of course you have the Pons and Parker here. Hello?
Yeah. That what I like to think of as the final credits thing, like the episode's over and now the credits roll on this freeze frame shot of the two of them going, what a wonderful case this was. But there was one more I did too.
The ending, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll show you that in a second. What I like about this one, and this kind of ties into one of David's Marcum's kind of theories, is it reminds me a lot of like the 30s Basil Rathbone films. This is kind of the look of it. And I know, David, you've proposed that the Rathbone films actually are Solar Pons films, not Sherlock Holmes films, right?
Well, not all of the Basil Rathbone films, just the first three Universals that are clearly set in World War II. They have to be set in World War II, like with bomb sites and Nazis and things like that. The rest of the Universal films could be set in or around World War I or even earlier. If you just ignored the cars and the clothing, it's the kind of cases that you would find earlier, that they're not specifically war-tied. I've actually written an essay about that was in the Baker Street Journal, and it's on my blog. And if I can find it here in double task, I'll put up the link for it.
Thank you. And if you can't find it now, David, just when you get a chance, email it to me and I can send it out to the group. Okay.
Okay.
Cool. All right. And then, of course, and as Brian said, there was the last one here, which is appropriate to wrap up our talk here. Why did you feel like you had to put an ending, a little bow on the end?
I was sometimes any writer here will understand, any writer or artist here will understand. Sometimes you're in the zone and you just don't stop. And I was just like, oh wait, I've got to draw this too. Now I think I just wrapped up the last one there with Pons and Parker, and I still wanted to keep going. I'm like, oh, I'll do this, and if we can fit it in, great, and if not, no worries. I can find a use for it. But hi, Dan.
All right,
Sorry.
Dan, we understand. Hey, things happen. Thank you
Hey.
so much for participating.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I
today.
just took a call from her. I gotta go or I'll be in big trouble.
We've all been there, my friend. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right.
But yes, I thought this this piece was nice at the very end of the book.
All right.
Rather like an Oscar Wilde bow tie.
Yeah. There
Exactly.
you go. All right. I'm going to stop sharing for a second here. We're going to come back to, I got a couple of slides at the end just to talk about. And if you haven't been looking at the chat as we've been kind of going along, there's been a lot of really nice comments about Brian's artwork. And then Steve Mason also put in an announcement for the Crew of the Bark Lone Stars meeting tomorrow at 1. That looks like everyone's invited to. Some of us here will be at the Dr. Watson's meeting in Denver at that time. So what I love about this time right now is just there's, one of the only pros of the pandemic really is that there's just been so much cool online Sherlock Holmes activity. And it's been great just that if, almost any weekend, if you want to do a Sherlock Holmes activity, you can. So it's really cool. All right. David, why don't we, I'm kind of curious. So as I said earlier, this was the last Solar Pons story. It's a Christmas story, but it's not the first Solar Pons Christmas story. So what are some of the other Solar Pons Christmas stories? And why do you think Derleth wrote more than one?
Well, I'm actually only aware of one other one, so you may have to correct me if I'm forgetting one. But the Stone of Scone starts on Christmas Day. I believe it. I don't know if he says in the story or if I've just made it in my own chronology, but I think it's 1930. And it starts on Christmas Day, and it mirrors the actual theft of the Stone of Scone, which occurred in 1950, I believe.
Right.
So there's not a lot of Christmas in that either, except that in real life, the theft for the Stone of Scone also occurred on Christmas Day. So that's when Derleth began his story. So if there are others that I've forgotten about, let me know.
I thought there was one, I mean, and I'm trying to remember, I thought in one of the essays, someone said there was another one that that took place at least in the Christmas season, but it was not necessarily a Christmas adventure.
It's possible. I didn't go back and look to check which ones. That's the only one that I remember off the top of my head.
Okay, cool. All right, let's talk about the story itself, guys. So what did people think? For some of you, this is probably your first Solar Pons story that you've read. What'd you think of the character? And again, I would say he was, this was definitely the cheery, happy Solar Pons in this particular story. But if anyone wants to chime in, you can just unmute. Or if you have a question for David or Brian for his illustrations, feel free to ask as well.
Well, good night.
Anna's on. Anna.
I have a question. Yeah, it's because in your book, it'd be page 128, because these are supposed to be Dickensians, right? Really collectors. But it says that there were inscribed copies, and he included Edwin Drood, but Edwin Drood, he died before he finished Edwin Drood, so he couldn't have an inscribed copy. So was that done? Do you think that was included on purpose, or it was just a mistake?
Larry, you look like you were going to say something. Do you have an answer to that? You're muted, Larry.
I did not have anything to say to it. I was just shocked by the intelligence of her discovery and her deduction. I'm like, aha, that's amazing.
There is an explanation for that.
Okay, great.
It was actually one of the clues that this is a forgery, I believe. And it's been a while since I've read this one, because since I did the editing for these several years ago, I'm afraid I haven't gone back and read them again. I kind of had enough for a little while. But on page 131, it talks about a Mr. Golders who left Brompton's last January. Mr. Golders is actually a book forger or a signature forger or something who was in one of the other Solar Pons stories called The Bookseller's Clerk. And that was kind of an apocryphal story that was in a series of little short things that Derleth put into the Pontine dossier for the fans. He wrote some little short stories for them. And the Bookseller's Clerk was a forger. So obviously he was involved in forging this Edwin Drood copy that's mentioned earlier in the story. So that's kind of a little fact that maybe, you know, a true fan or a deep dive fan would have spotted, but it's not a connection that's easily explained otherwise.
I had wondered about that because was it implying that he really didn't know what he was doing, this collector? It was, you know, would have a forgery of that.
There's one way to read it, I guess, in that pieces of Edwin Drood had been published in magazines. So I suppose it's possible that, you know, there were inscribed copies of individual chapters or issues.
The first 3 chapters were printed. I think he wrote 6, but only 3 were published before he died. And then he didn't obviously write the rest. So,
but anyway, that Mr. Golders explanation, that's what that's referring to.
All right, great. Thanks.
You know, one of the things I think that you have to pay attention to and enjoy in this particular story is the humor of it. And I think that could also be, if it was intended as a joke, you know, that for collectors or Dickensians to catch, I could see that being Derleth winking at us with that particular piece. I did want to talk a little about the humor in this, because one of the other things that's really interesting, if you read the 3 stories in the 3 pipe, is they get funnier and funnier as they go along. I mean, Blue Carbuncle really isn't a funny story, but Unique Hamlet is. I mean, Holmes, it sometimes is almost a caricature of himself, like when he jumps on the ground to look at the footprints and stuff like that. And then, of course, the characters in here are quite humorous, with Ebenezer Snolly in particular. So I was just wondering, what do people, and then of course there's that great line, about making fun of collectors, that all collectors, they're all a little crazy. That was a great line in there. Charles, you can probably agree with that one.
There's a degree of crazy. God, it's been so long since I've read this thing. 30 years, I'm guessing. It was probably one of the first things I picked up back then. But this is still charming. You stick with it. There's something about it that reminds me a little bit of like kind of a gentle, softer version of Robert Bloch's The Man Who Collected Poe, in a way. There's that sort of connection, which may have triggered Derleth, actually, because he was likely working with Bloch anyway on some of his other publications. But it's just such a charming story and rather uncharacteristic, I think, of the Pons canon, but fun stuff.
And I was just curious, what did people think of the Solar Pons character, especially if you haven't read Solar Pons before? Feel free to jump in.
I'm kind of ambivalent because I've always had a sore spot for parody done in a way to denigrate, I guess. You see a lot of that currently in movies and current production, and it kind of just rubs me the wrong way, because I think that you can be funny, but I think that the hallmark of writing a good pastiche or a parody is you've got to take the character seriously, even if the character isn't serious. That's just my feeling. So, it kind of rubbed me a little wrong from that standpoint, although Derleth wrote it, so it's his character. So there's that. If someone else had written it, I don't know if that wouldn't have put me off. Like I said, it's something that's been a very long-standing problem with me, because I've seen so many things where they started out really well, and they degenerate into this farce, and then I just get totally, I don't want to see any more of it. So take that for what it's worth.
Okay, Nancy and then Larry.
I'm really interested right now in what is the difference between Sherlockians and a fandom. Do Sherlockians consider themselves part of a fandom? And how do you decide you're part of that? And how do you decide if a Sherlock Holmes pastiche is a good one or a real one, or if it's really Sherlock Holmes? And I looked at many of the early pastiches, and the first one of the very first ones is James M. Barrie's An Evening with Sherlock Holmes, or Dinner with whatever it's called. And it's very much a parody. He makes so clear fun of Sherlock Holmes, but he's doing it to tease Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And so when are you addressing the actual author, the creator? When are you addressing the character? It's really, really interesting. And it's so slippery to me. And when I talk about it, I think, what are you talking about? But it's really, really cool, because it's like this huge group with all these sub ways of connecting with each other. And so talking about a parody or a pastiche or a Solar Pons part of the gang of Sherlock Holmes are people who like Solar Pons Sherlockians. It's really, really interesting. So I'm loving this meeting today. It's just meat for my table. So I don't really have anything conclusive to say, except the approaches are so different, and people's ownership of all of this is just so varied. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so strong and lasts and endures.
And I think I could, to answer one of your questions, Nancy, I think I can say not all Sherlockians are Ponzians, but all Ponzians are Sherlockians. I think it's very difficult to be a fan of Solar Pons and not a fan of Sherlock Holmes. So it's interesting. Yeah, Larry.
Well, I mean, the thing about Solar Pons is that what permeates his love of Sherlock Holmes, but with Derleth's love of Sherlock Holmes. And one of the advantages that Pons has over other kinds of pastiches, which take Sherlock Holmes more seriously, is that Solar Pons doesn't have to be exactly like Sherlock Holmes really was. So, like, if you wrote a pastiche where Sherlock Holmes was sitting in Baker Street with his deerstalker cap on, like Derrick is, I would say this guy really doesn't know Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle's Holmes, right? But Solar Pons can put that on, and who am I to say? Because he's not Sherlock Holmes, he's Solar Pons, so he can do that stuff. And so there's always, I think in the first essay of the first Sherlock Holmes book, Solar Pons book, there in the introductory essay, it says something about how there's always, even though he's very serious about who he is and what he's doing, there's always a little twinkle in his eye that lets you know that this is really, that he knows that he's not Sherlock Holmes, and he knows that we know he's not Sherlock Holmes, but he's going to play it like he is, because that's the fun of the character. I was going to ask, my question though was, Pons, I don't think Pons ever had a literary character in his stories from outside of the canon, nor or inside the canon for that matter, nor did he ever have a real person in his story whose name wasn't changed or altered. The changing of Sherlock Holmes's name to Solar Pons, I don't think his Fu Manchu character wasn't called Fu Manchu for sure, but that's also true of his Hercule Poirot character and his and other parody characters that snuck in and out of the story because he had a love of these characters. But again, I don't know. I'm not a Pons, as much of a Pons expert as some here. So maybe I'm wrong. Did you guys know of any story that he did?
Yes, you're wrong.
Okay.
Because Carnegie is mentioned in one of the Solar Pons stories. That's just the one that comes into mind. Carnegie, the Ghost Finder.
Oh, okay.
Carnegie is mentioned, and Pons defends him to Parker and says that he's legit. I mean, so that would be one.
I'm surprised. Okay.
And in Orient Express, does he actually mention the Saint David by name? Because I know the Saint's at least in there, but I can't remember if he mentions his name.
It's described so you know who he is, and he draws the little saint symbol when he leaves.
Right.
But it's clearly the Saint.
Right, and he has a Hercule Poirot character in the Orient Express as well, who's got a different name and even kind of a different background.
Well, it's spelled by one letter wrong, and he's French instead of Belgian.
Right, exactly. Right, clearly.
And I would argue the sci-fan that was Fu Manchu's group, and they are mentioned. I mean, would you agree with that?
But I suppose that I do agree with that. But the Sherlock Holmes, that's a point that I missed. But but they do give the Chinese character a name. That's not Fu Manchu.
I call him the Devil Doctor sometimes.
Yes,
yeah,
that's it.
Okay.
He doesn't have a name.
All right. Well, that's the way. Well, that's good. So it gives me some.
All right.
more
I want to
insight.
make sure I get everybody who wants to have a chance.
Sure.
Shayna, you've been kind of raising your hand there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I didn't see the story as a Sherlock Holmes parody, but I did see it as Derleth playing games with the readers, like kind of winking at his audience, like saying, can you catch all the, Dickensian references in the names, Ebenezer, Mika Auber, which, Macabre, Pip, from Great Expectations. And then also like the fact that our client shows up in a hansom cab dressed in old-fashioned clothing. I mean, that reminds me of the first BSI dinner where I can't remember if it was Christopher Morley who showed up in a hansom cab, but somebody definitely did that. So and just the fact that this is like the Unique Dickensians, which invokes the unique Hamlet. So that, there's a lot of kind of waving at the Sherlockians and Dickensian friends, like, I see you, I know you're out there, enjoy.
Tom Turley?
I just wondered whether David might like to say something about the family relationship that he has drawn in some of his pastiches between Solar Pons and Sherlock Holmes.
Well, I will. Some people like that and some people don't. Way back when, I used to speculate who is this guy named Solar Pons, because he was so Sherlockian. There was an old theory years ago that he was Billy the Page grown up, and I never liked that. But I had come to this conclusion that he must be a nephew of Sherlock Holmes. And in fact, when I decided to write stories, the first one I ever wanted to write was a Solar Pons origin story. But I didn't really feel comfortable yet because that's kind of taken on a big thing. So I practiced with trying to write some other stories. And then I wrote a story called The Adventure of the Other Brother, in which Holmes has an older brother, which was theorized in the Baring Gould biography, named Sharonford Holmes. And Sharonford has 3 sons who kind of mirror the Sharonford, Mycroft, Sherlock generation. But in that, it's an older son, and then Bancroft and the youngest son, who in that story was actually called Sigurd Holmes after his grandfather. But he's very Holmes-like. He's brilliant. And he wants to basically become a consulting detective, but to do it on his own. So that's why he changes his name. And so that story was in my first book collection, and then it's been reprinted other places too. But I'm not a Wold Newton person who thinks every literary character is related, but I did perceive kind of this to go along with like the idea that Nero Wolfe is Holmes's son. So in this case, Sigurd Holmes or Solar Pons is Holmes's nephew, which makes him Nero Wolfe's cousin. And I've written some stories where they appear as cousins, kind of under other names, but if you know what you're looking for, it's them.
Thanks.
All right. Any other final comments before we kind of wrap up? And we'll talk about next month's meeting.
I'd just like to say one thing. This is a great story, but in some ways, it's not a typical Pons story because of the winks and the different aspects in relation to other stories. So if you're interested, go read some of the others because they're straight, serious mysteries. There's no humor in them. There's no parody. Pons is a deductive Sherlockian type detective who solves sometimes some pretty grim mysteries too. So delve into it a little deeper.
All right, thank you so much, Brian and David, for being part of the presentation. Let's give them a round of virtual applause.
Shucks.
All right, a couple of things to wrap up here. First, if you haven't been paying attention in the chat, Madeline, I'm glad you put in the link there. If you want to talk a little about that for a second, Madeline, you're doing a whole virtual events for BSI weekend for those of us who can't make it. You want to say a plug for it? I'll show it again in January too.
Yeah, so a few different groups are doing different virtual activities during BSI weekend. ACD Society and Literary Agents are both hosting stuff. The big event of the weekend will be pub night at the Dangling Prussian, the same night as the BSI dinner. And that'll go on for several hours, and I think it's going to be a whole lot of fun. And then Saturday of that weekend, my podcast, Dynamics of Podcast, is going to host a table discussion about Moriarty. So far, we only have like 4 people signed up. So like the more the merrier, because I'm hoping to find out, like everybody's favorite Moriartys and have a lively discussion. And then tentatively, John H. Watson Society is going to do something immediately afterwards, but I think Brad Kefauver is a little more focused on pub night right now, so we'll see how Watson Society's event pans out. But on the blog post, I've got a list of all the events and the links to different stuff to be able to register or RSVP. So please check that out if you're going to do that.
And Larry just pointed out that, you know, once the meeting ends, the links kind of go away. So that's true. So I'll be happy to send that out. Okay. Perfect. Excellent. All right. And so next month, we got a kind of a treat, which is going to be, I'm really looking forward to. Share my screen for a second here. In that, and I'll have Anna talk a little bit about this, but we're actually going to do it's going to be on New Year's Day, but we're going to actually have a little bit of voice actors here, and we're going to be reading the story Trifles and actually hearing an audio version of the play and its connections with the Abbey Grange. So if you've never read Trifles by Glaspell, it is an amazing play. It's considered some considered an early feminist work, and the characters in there actually have some ties to Holmes and Watson. Anna, do you want to say a little bit about it for right now? A little preview what we're going to get. Oh, is she still on?
Yeah, I'm still here. Sorry,
Okay.
I was muted.
That's okay.
Sorry about that. Yes. Well, actually, my Sherlockian scion, we have a lot of actors, and here in Keene, New Hampshire, they're part of the Edge Ensemble Theater Company, and they did a film of Trifles by Susan Glaspell, and it's available on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. It's only 30 minutes long, but it's well done, and it sticks very closely to the original script. But I was watching that, and then I was also watching the Abbey Grange afterward, and I realized, there's a lot of similarities between these two. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, and we're going to have the director and the two stars of the film, who are the kind of Holmes and Watson characters of the story. So it is a really good play, really well done. And yes, it is, I think, still taught in a lot of feminist studies courses. So it's still relevant, and I think it'll be fun. So I hope you join us.
Thank you, guys. So remember, actors, things like that. So even if you're hungover from New Year's, you can still join us, and just stay on mute. I'm really looking forward to it. And I will, of course, send out the YouTube link so you can also watch the play of it before we have our discussion on New Year's Day. So really, really looking forward to that one. All right, everyone, that pretty much wraps up our talk for today. Just went a couple minutes over. I know, Larry, you had said, "Oh, are we going to contain it?" We managed to. All right.
Actually, my I think you got confused. My concern was I was thinking that you should extend the meeting.
Oh,
it was so much fun for a half hour. That's what I was really suggesting, but that's okay.
Well, I'll try to keep it condensed to 1 hour. Everyone's done. But anyway, really hopefully I see everybody back in January. Happy holidays to everyone. Take care, and really hope I'll see you guys on January 1st. And Madeline, please, if I think I've got the link, but if you wouldn't mind emailing it out to me again, I'll make sure I include it to everyone, okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.